It is the 14th of July 1944, and somewhere in the bocage country of Normandy, a Tiger I tank sits motionless in the shadow of a hedgerow. The crew have been in position since before dawn. The gunner, a 23-year-old from Cologne named Werner, has done this 100 times. He knows his gun. He trusts his gun. The 8.8 centimeter KBWK 36 is, by almost every objective measure, the finest tank cannon in the world at this moment in the war. It has destroyed Shermans at ranges beyond 1,800 meters. It has punched through the frontal armor of Soviet heavy tanks that were supposed to be impenetrable. Werner has fired it in the snow outside Leningrad and in the dust outside Tobruk. He has never once had reason to doubt it. He traverses the turret, he acquires his target, he squeezes the trigger. The barrel explodes, not the ammunition, not the propellant charge. The barrel itself, that 56 caliber tube of precision machined Krupp steel, detonates from the inside outward, shredding the breech ring, killing the gunner instantly, and quite often taking the loader with him in the same catastrophic fraction of a second. By the time German ordnance engineers have collected enough wreckage to begin understanding what happened, it has happened again. And again. And across two different theatres of the war, in tanks with no obvious common history, no shared maintenance problems, no manufacturing defects that anyone can identify. The Tiger's legendary gun is killing German crews. And the cause, when it is finally identified, is something so simple, so absurdly low technology, so resolutely unglamorous that it barely seems possible. It is a wire, a short length of steel wire, no thicker than a knitting needle, inserted into the barrel of the gun before it fires. British in origin. Delivered not by aircraft, not by commando raid, but by the landscape itself. This is the story of one of the most quietly lethal pieces of British sabotage ever deployed, and of why something that cost almost nothing to produce turned out to cost Germany some of its finest armoured assets, and its crews their lives. The Tiger I tank entered operational service in September 1942 near Leningrad. From the very first engagement, it was apparent that the Wehrmacht had built something categorically different from anything that had come before. Its frontal armour was 100 millimetres thick, angled enough to deflect most Allied anti-tank rounds at combat ranges. Its side armour was 80 millimetres. At a time when the British 2-pounder anti-tank gun was struggling to defeat even the older Panzer IVs at close range, the Tiger was functionally impervious to the standard Allied arsenal at anything beyond a few hundred metres. But what truly set the Tiger apart was not its protection. It was that gun. The KWK-36 fired an 88mm shell with a muzzle velocity of approximately 773 meters per second in its standard armour-piercing configuration. To put that figure in context, the shell was travelling at roughly 2.5 times the speed of sound from the moment it left the barrel. At 1,000 meters, it could penetrate 120 millimeters of vertical rolled homogeneous armor, more than enough to defeat virtually every Allied tank then in service. The American M4 Sherman, which formed the backbone of the Allied armored forces in Western Europe, had frontal armor of between 50 and 75 millimeters, depending on variant. The maths was not encouraging. Allied commanders understood the problem with brutal clarity. The Tiger was not merely a superior tank, it was a different class of problem entirely, one that required tactical adaptation rather than a straightforward technical counter. Fighting a Tiger in a Sherman or a Churchill or a Cromwell required either extremely close-range flanking shots against thinner side armour, the use of specialised high-velocity guns from concealed positions, or sheer weight of numbers that accepted catastrophic loss ratios as the price of victory. None of these solutions were satisfying. None of them were cheap in human terms. The Tiger's psychological effect was at least as significant as its material impact. German tank commanders understood this and exploited it deliberately. A single Tiger could hold a road junction, anchor a defensive line, or stop an armoured advance simply by existing. by being visible or by being rumoured to be visible. Allied crews had been briefed on its capabilities and many had seen the results firsthand. The word tiger passing over a radio net had a measurable effect on tactical decision-making that no army manual could fully quantify. The problem was not merely armour and gun barrels, the problem was fear, and fear, unlike armour, could not simply be outranged. British military intelligence and the Special Operations Executive had been studying the Tiger's operational procedures since the first confirmed kills in Tunisia in early 1943. What they identified was not a weakness in the armour, nor a flaw in the mechanical system. What they found was a maintenance habit, a standard operational procedure, a small but consistent vulnerability in the way German tank crews prepared their weapons before engagement. Standard German practice, as documented in captured training manuals and confirmed by prisoner interrogations, required that the barrel of the KWK-36, along with virtually every other large-caliber tank gun in Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS service, be fitted with a bore obstruction device when the tank was not actively in combat. This was entirely sensible engineering. The barrel of the 88mm gun was a precision instrument. Moisture, debris, mud, and the general filth of the battlefield could corrode the rifling, contaminate the propellant gases, or introduce foreign material that would compromise accuracy. The obstruction device, a simple plug of wood, rubber, or, in later models, a fitted metal cap, kept the bore clean between engagements. The procedure upon preparing to engage was equally standardized. The loader removed the plug. The gunner confirmed the bore was clear. The commander ordered the gun loaded. In the stress of combat under fire, with enemy rounds impacting the hull, this confirmation step, a brief visual check or a manual sweep of the bore, was sometimes abbreviated. Not always, not even frequently, but sometimes, and sometimes was enough. The British device that exploited this habit was developed in the spring of 1943, and its full designation remains to this day partially classified in a handful of the relevant operational files. It is known colloquially as the Stacheldrahteinlage in captured German reports, the barbed wire insert, though the British term used in the relevant SOE and MI-10 documentation refers to it more prosaically simply as the barrel obstruction or BO device. It was at its core a length of hardened steel wire, typically between 15 and 25 centimetres in length and between 6 and 8 millimetres in diameter, with a small lateral hook or crosspiece at one end, designed to catch on the interior lands of the rifle bore and resist being blown clear by a casual visual inspection or a light prodding. The device was manufactured in several facilities, including workshops associated with the Birmingham Small Arms Company, and at least one facility in the Midlands whose records have not been fully declassified. Production figures are not publicly available in their entirety, but the documents that have been released suggest manufacture ran into the tens of thousands of individual units over the course of the programme's most active period between mid-1943 and the summer of 1944. Each unit cost a negligible amount to produce, raw material, machining time, and a small rubberized sheath for the outward-facing end, designed to make it resemble the standard German bore plug from a casual inspection. The total material cost per unit, adjusted to contemporary values, was likely equivalent to the price of a cup of tea. The delivery mechanism was the genuine innovation. SOE handlers working with French, Belgian and Dutch resistance networks were tasked not with placing the devices themselves, which would have required direct access to guarded German armoured parks, but with inserting them into the German maintenance supply chain. Resistance operatives working in vehicle workshops, supply depots and ordnance facilities where German equipment passed for repair and servicing would substitute the false plugs for genuine bore obstruction devices in storage crates and resupply shipments. A tank returning to a field workshop for routine maintenance might have its existing plug swapped for a BO device during the process of servicing. The crew would receive it back looking exactly as it had when they handed it over. The physics of what happened next were, from an engineering perspective, quite straightforward. A standard 88mm propellant charge generates a chamber pressure of approximately 3,200 atmospheres at the moment of firing, the equivalent of roughly 47,000 pounds of force per square inch. This pressure is designed to be contained by the breech and channeled uniformly down the bore to accelerate the shell. The bore obstruction device was positioned some way down the barrel beyond the initial expansion chamber, seated against the rifling. When the gun fired, the shell struck the obstruction before it could develop full velocity. The resulting pressure spike, occurring in a fraction of a millisecond, was not uniform. It was catastrophic. The barrel failed at or near the point of obstruction, fragmenting outward at the moment of highest stress. At the velocities and pressures involved, the fragments of the barrel itself became high-velocity projectiles inside the fighting compartment. The gunner, seated directly behind the breech, was killed by these fragments in every reliably documented case. The loader, positioned adjacent to the breech, was killed or severely injured in the majority of them. German ordnance investigations were initially baffled because the nature of the failure, a catastrophic bore rupture, was consistent with a manufacturing defect in the barrel steel. The first reports attributed the incidents to metallurgical failure under combat stress, a problem Krupp had documented in early production runs of some heavy artillery pieces. It was not until investigators began comparing the physical evidence from multiple incidents and until a partially intact device was recovered from a barrel that had failed to fully detonate the obstruction that the true cause was identified. By that point, estimates suggest that somewhere between 40 and 80 Tiger and Panther tanks across multiple operational theatres had been lost to BO device-related barrel failures, though the precise figure is uncertain because many incidents were attributed to combat damage in the initial field reports and were never re-examined. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. German engineers were thorough, and once they understood what they were facing, they responded with characteristic methodical intensity. From late 1943 onwards, German armoured units were instructed to implement a mandatory visual bore inspection using a standardised bore lamp before every firing of the main gun. The new procedure required not merely removing the plug, but physically sighting down the barrel to confirm clearance. It added perhaps 45 seconds to the pre-engagement procedure. In many tactical situations, that 45 seconds was operationally insignificant. In others, an ambush, a sudden encounter at close range, a hasty defensive deployment, it was time that simply did not exist. Comparative analysis reveals a wider picture. The Germans developed their own version of the concept, though directed against different targets and deployed in different circumstances. The Zünderparat, a small incendiary device disguised as a standard vehicle component, was used by German agents against British motor transport and armoured vehicles in North Africa with some success, though it was never scaled to the same industrial level as the British BO programme. The Americans, operating largely through the Office of Strategic Services rather than the SOE, developed their own bore obstruction variants but deployed them with less systematic integration into resistance supply chains. The British advantage was not in the device itself. The concept was straightforward enough that any competent engineer could have developed it independently, but in the infrastructure of the French, Belgian and Dutch resistance networks, which provided the distribution channels that made the programme viable at scale. The psychological dimension deserves particular attention. German tank crews who became aware of the programme, and awareness spread through unit rumour and official briefings from late 1943, faced a corrosive new problem. The 88mm gun had been, for them, a point of absolute confidence. The gun did not fail. The gun was the reason the Tiger could engage at ranges where enemy fire was ineffective in return. To learn that the gun itself might have been sabotaged, that the bore plug they had relied on might be a lethal substitute, introduced a category of uncertainty that no amount of training or mechanical excellence could entirely eliminate. Several post-war testimonies from Tiger crew veterans collected by historians in the 1970s and 1980s describe a period in which crews were reluctant to fire immediately upon acquiring a target, needing additional seconds to complete the bore inspection, seconds which could prove decisive in an engagement. The legacy of the BO device program is difficult to assess with precision because the historical record is incomplete in specific ways. The SOE archive at Kew contains operational summaries that reference the program but redact production figures and specific distribution routes. The German investigation records, captured at the end of the war, were distributed among British, American and Soviet intelligence agencies, and have not been comprehensively cross-referenced in any published academic work. The British official history of special operations deliberately understates the programme's scale, almost certainly for reasons of ongoing sensitivity regarding the resistance networks involved. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that the programme demonstrated something the Second World War proved repeatedly in different contexts, that a technically sophisticated weapon system creates a correspondingly sophisticated vulnerability. The Tiger's gun was extraordinary precisely because it was so powerful, and it was so powerful because it operated at pressures and velocities that left virtually no margin for obstruction. A weapon designed to kill at 2 kilometres could be defeated by a piece of hardened steel wire costing a few pence. The gap between those two facts is, in itself, a lesson that military engineers and intelligence services have never entirely stopped discussing. Surviving examples of the device are not, to the author's knowledge, currently on public display in any museum. The Imperial War Museum holds documents related to the broader SOE technical programme, and the Tank Museum at Bovington in Dorset maintains archives that include German investigation reports referencing unexplained bore failures, though the connection to the British programme is not explicitly made in the public-facing materials. Several Tiger tanks survive in running or static condition, notably the Tiger at Bovington itself, one of the very few mechanically intact examples remaining in the world. And the 88mm gun on that vehicle retains its original bore dimensions, a reminder of both what the weapon was capable of and how comprehensively the British understood its mechanics. Return then to that bocage hedgerow. Return to Werner, 23 years old, trained, experienced, confident in his machine. He is not a figure of abstraction. He is a man doing what soldiers do, holding a position, following a procedure, trusting his equipment. The Tiger was genuinely a formidable weapon. The men who crewed it were, in the main, skilled professionals who had earned their places in those vehicles through training and combat experience. The BO device did not respect any of that. It asked only one thing, that the bore inspection procedure, under stress, in the dark, in the noise and confusion of imminent engagement, be skipped for 45 seconds. This is what serious intelligence work actually looks like, stripped of the romantic apparatus of spies and codebreakers and moonlit drops. It is not always glamorous. It is not always visible. It is sometimes a length of wire in a crate of spares in a workshop in occupied Belgium, waiting patiently for the moment when the most powerful tank gun in the world would destroy itself from the inside out. It is the understanding that systems designed for maximum performance are also designed for maximum fragility, that the tolerance which makes a weapon deadly is precisely the tolerance which makes it vulnerable. One length of wire, one missing check. One man gone. The greatest guns in the world can be silenced not by a better gun, but by a better understanding of exactly how they work.